Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to explore a little bit of a hypothetical situation. We are going to discuss the pros and cons of lever action rifles versus bolt action rifles in a military sense. So we kind of got to set a scenario here. Let's talk about perhaps a globe-spanning conflict kicking off in the early 20th century. And perhaps a military or country involved in that conflict would run into a position where they were strapped for rifles, where they just couldn't get enough of them at all, and needed to turn somewhere in order to be able to get weapon systems. What they would wind up doing would be, in this case, they decide to look at the American sporting market and select an American sporting arm. So with that being the case, let's go ahead and introduce our players for this comparison and discussion. Now, the arm that we will be considering, what will represent this entry, will be this Winchester Model 94, previously reviewed on this channel. Chambered in .30-30 Winchester. This rifle originally was introduced in 1894, totally would be available for the time period that we're talking about. And now we will be comparing it against this Swedish M38 Mauser, also previously reviewed on the channel. Links will be in the description for all videos that I mentioned, because we're actually going to cover quite a bit, or reference quite a bit of content that I've already previously covered. Now, this is chambered in 6.5 by 55 millimeter Swedish Mauser. Also, both of these are cartridges that we've talked about previously on this channel. Now, why did I choose what I did? Well, the 1894 actually did see exceedingly limited service during World War I. It was adopted by the French, British, and had some light use by American forces. However, it did not necessarily see frontline combat. It was mostly used by rear echelon types in order to be able to free up more rifles for the front line. Now, why did I choose a 1941 dated Swedish Mauser? This rifle wouldn't come out until 1938, and it's not even available for the time frame that we're discussing. Well, a lot of that comes down to availability of some of the pieces and parts that I need to be able to effectively conduct this comparison in my collection right now. So I have other rifles that would more favorably suit the time period that we're talking about. However, we are talking about bolt actions, and this rifle in its present configuration is not that different from a lot of rifles that were already available during World War I. There's not a lot of massive changes in bolt action technology between World War I and World War II, especially since this is a Mauser 1893 action. So this was totally heavily used during World War I, the action was. So we have plenty to be able to compare here. Now, also, this rifle is indicative of a lot of the best aspects of bolt action rifles during World War I. So it's a really effective way to be able to make this comparison, is to be able to say whether or not this rifle would be able to perform as well as this rifle does in combat. Now, a couple of things to highlight for this discussion. Now, this actually did happen to the Russians during World War I. They would come to declare rifles to be more valuable than gold. They could not produce enough of their 1891 Mosin Nagants, so they would actually wind up turning to the U.S. manufacturing commercial side of things and request that Winchester make a couple of updates to the 1895 Winchester lever action rifle. And what they would wind up changing is that they would add a bayonet lug, consistent with the bayonet that they were already using, that they would add a handguard, as well as adjustable sights, and stripper clip feed to the box magazine of the 1895. That's why they went after it specifically. And I really wish I had an 1895 present for this comparison, because I really want one of those in my collection. I find that to be an extremely fascinating rifle, chambered in the 7.62 by 5.4. Like, just, it would be really cool to have one. However, they're kind of rare and kind of hard to come by, and that's why we kind of have to go with the 1894 in this case. So we're gonna have to talk through a couple of different aspects of these rifles and see if there's if in this present configuration, or maybe with a couple of minor adjustments, if we could get this rifle to be effective enough to fight on the front lines in World War I. So let's go ahead and roll down some of our features. First off, we have A carbine length barrel. Now, during this time period, carbines are considered primarily to be used by cavalry, and then also used by shorter overall patterns are used by rear echelon or non-infantry types. So cannon crewmen would have shorter rifle setups. This is actually what the French would issue their cannon crewmen in order to be able to free up Lebel rifles for the front, as well as like engineers and all that kind of stuff. The whole idea being is that most of the time these guys have these rifles stacked off to the side. They're not going to spend a lot of time fighting. They don't need all the things that go into an infantry arm. They can have something that's a little bit smaller because it doesn't need to be used in the same way. If they're fighting, it's because there's been a breakthrough and they're trying to push those guys back. Now, in this case, this barrel doesn't help it except to say that well, it doesn't hurt it, I guess. But it doesn't help either because a lot of militaries at this time, if they were looking to buy a suitable substitute rifle for frontline use, they would want a full-length barrel. So right off the bat, this being a carbine layout doesn't really play into that. Now, this is because there's a bit of a misconception between the importance of barrel length and range. Not to say that it doesn't have a role to play as much as for the actual distance of fighting that's occurring in World War I, this rifle would be perfectly suited at this barrel length. Pre-World War I, it was believed that now that we have Spitzer-type bullets and smokeless powder and these, high-velocity rounds and all this kind of stuff, that now fighting was going to be able to take advantage of those attributes, and now you're going to be shooting people at 500 yards consistently. You're just going to be salvoing rounds at each other at 500 yards, and whoever the best marksman is going to win and all that kind of stuff. That's not the reality of World War I. And that's unfortunate because a lot of rifles were sighted in for 500 yards while not getting used at 500 yards. So the concept at the time revolved around a lot of times aiming at the belly button or the belt buckle, so that no matter where your enemy was standing at, you would be able to hit him somewhere between his head and the belt buckle that you're aiming at. So from 500 on in, you just have to aim there and you're going to hit him somewhere. Well, that's all well and good when the guy's apparently standing out in the field silhouetting himself and giving you all the time in the world to be able to draw a bead on him. It is not that way when he's ducking up and over the edge of a trench and all he's exposing is his head. So now at 150 yards, you've got to figure out roughly where that man's belt buckle is by staring at the ground and then adjusting appropriately to hit him in the face. It's kind of difficult. So this setup might be a little bit better suited to that overall, but there's a couple things that are missing. First off, a bayonet lug. Obviously, this being a sporting arm, this rifle is not designed to go with a bayonet, unlike any military arm at the time. So that's a problem because bayonets are a big deal in World War I. Everybody needs to be able to know how to use a bayonet. Everybody needs to have access to a bayonet. They need to have their bayonet ready to go because when you go charging across no man's land, you're doing it with a bayonet. When the enemy comes charging across no man's land at you, you're going to fix your bayonet so that once you run out of bullets, you can at least keep using your rifle as a spear. It's better than nothing. So, obviously, this cannot accept that. And it probably wouldn't take a lot of effort to change that. However, that's going to impact a couple things that we're going to have to talk about as we go through. So maybe you could get Winchester to mount a bayonet lug on this. They did it for the 1895. Why not this one? Now also, as we can see here, we do not have a handguard. And it may not seem like a big deal until you're in the middle of a battle and you're really pumping through rounds and all that kind of stuff, and this barrel gets hot, it's not a whole lot of surface area to grip here, and you keep touching that barrel, it's going to get old, real fast. So I would think a handguard was something that would need to be added. Probably wouldn't be very difficult for Winchester to do it. They did it with the 1895, but it does mean that we're now adding two parts so far that we want changed out on this rifle in order to make it more credible on the battlefield. That is going to cause some time in redesign. It's also going to increase manufacturing time for this rifle. A couple things to take into account if you are pressed for rifles and you need them right now. Now, also, if we fix a bayonet lug, we're totally going to have a handguard because trying to stab somebody like this doesn't make any sense. You're going to want to choke up on that, just like you would any other spear, so that you can be able to get your thrust in there. So, handguard's going to become a necessity if we're trying to use this as a military arm, just like this rifle. See? Handguard. Bayonet lug. It's got the things that it needs. Now, let's talk about these sights. This rifle comes standard with buckhorn sights, which might be fantastic for, you know, doing your everyday plinking or hunting and all that kind of stuff. But for the time period, this is not indicative of good sights. What militaries are using at this time are some type of ramp or ladder sight, as we see here on this Mauser. We can adjust the sight accordingly so as to be able to hit targets at greater overall distances. Now, of course, a lot of the rifles at this time have their sights calibrated out to like 1900 meters. That's for like volley fire type stuff, which really isn't getting used in World War I because machine guns exist. So the buckhorns might be good from the standpoint of today. Lots of people use fixed sights. Fixed sights come standard on AR-15s all the time, and you can hit out to great distances with fixed sights if you understand how to be able to work your holdovers and hold unders and all that kind of stuff. But the sights of the time that come standard on a lot of these military arms are adjusted in such a manner so that a soldier can estimate or be told the distance, adjust his sights accordingly, and then he should just have to hold on the target and make an impact. That's all that's supposed to happen. That's a really easy thing to train somebody with. You go ahead and teach them the fundamentals, and then you explain to them, go ahead and push that drawer in, go ahead and explain to them how, you know, all this stuff works together, and then just adjust your sights to the distance that the enemy's at and you'll hit them. Or you might have to maybe make a little bit of some adjustments on where you're holding on them in order to hit them, but you'll at least have the distance dialed in. You don't have that on this. So now we either A, have to spend more time on the rifle range getting someone to understand holdovers and hold unders with fixed sights, or the more likely possibility, which is we're not going to wind up spending a lot of time stressing out on teaching guys how to shoot these rifles. So here you go, bud. Have a good day. See you later. Out the door you go. So the question becomes, does this hypothetical military who's, you know, concerned about losing the war due to lack of rifle production, do they swap out these sights? And then if they swap out these sights and they add a bayonet lug, they now have to recalibrate these sights for the bayonet lug. And then also your handguard placement is going to potentially affect your sights. Now also take this into account, getting into our next point, which is going to be the cartridge. The 30-30 Winchester is known for having a very rainbow-like trajectory. Blah, that was hard to say. So most people have a tendency to call it a 200-yard cartridge because the drop-off is pretty significant after 200 yards. However, I have been able to hit steel out to 400 yards with iron sights on a 30-30 rifle. So it's possible. The adjustments are pretty significant, but it is totally possible to do. And you can probably get a little bit more distance out of them if you have adjustable sights that you can work with. I will say that trying to go that far off of the fixed sights would be pretty difficult for a poorly trained or rapidly trained soldier to be able to do in an actual combat environment. Now the cartridge at this time is a 160 grain round-nosed cartridge projectile, which is not high technology for the time. Round-nosed projectiles were quickly outpaced by Spitzer-type projectiles for having flatter shooting trajectories as well as higher velocities, which we see in this rifle, which is using a 139 grain Spitzer-type projectile. Now, a couple of things. During World War I, the Swedes would actually be using a 160 grain round nose projectile because they didn't see a need to go over to a Spitzer projectile, and they would actually stick with that up until 1941. But pretty much every other military that could manage to do so had already adjusted over to a Spitzer type cartridge. So that's why I say this. That's another reason for why I say this is indicative of a lot of the best attributes of rifles serving in this conflict. And we really cannot switch over to a Spitzer type projectile in this because we have a tubular magazine and we have rounds stacked tip to butt in the magazine tube, which when you then introduce the shock of recoil potentially may cause you to improvise a firing pin out of the tip of one of the bullets and the primer of the round in front of it and cause your magazine tube to explode. That'd be pretty bad, right? So you wind up having to stick with a round nose type projectile. Tubular magazines are still present on the battlefield in World War One. There are a couple of Kropatschek style magazine rifle systems out on the battlefield, like the French Lebel, that still utilize tubular magazines. You do have a 6-round tubular magazine as opposed to the 5-round magazine on this rifle, but this rifle feeds from a strip clip, which holds 5 rounds. So all I have to do is fire my last round, eject it, cram my strip clip in there, cram my ammunition in the magazine, and then I'm ready to go. Whereas with the lever action rifle, I have to hand feed those cartridges through the loading gate. That's slower. That's much slower. But I had a little bit of a revelation while I was sitting here thinking about this comparison, some of the pros and cons. What would actually be really interesting to see would be if you could somehow adapt a magazine cutoff feature. Now, a magazine cutoff feature going into World War I was actually fairly common, but you would see it quickly taper off for a couple of reasons. One, production refinement, because a lot of things, a lot of extra things that you put on rifles that seem like a really good idea wind up costing a lot of extra time and materials to be able to produce them. Like, especially when we talk about changing out these iron sights. Wars have been lost or heavily affected by accurate production of iron sights, be it that rifles were not produced fast enough or the sights were produced incorrectly and the point of impact was wrong for the rifle. That's one of the things you have to take into account anytime you change some aspect of this rifle to be able to get it into the battlefield, in the hands of soldiers. But something that I think that might work is if you could somehow incorporate a lever, a little arm that you could swing out of the way, but also would obstruct the motion of the actual lever, so that you could eject the spent cartridge, not pick up the next cartridge on the lifter, and then insert a live round into the chamber by hand, close the rifle, and then go back into work, which would keep your magazine on reserve. And that was one of the key things about magazine cutoffs, was that you would be able to take well-aimed shots at distance, based on you're doing some salvo type stuff and you have an officer ordering you when to load your rifle and all that. Or if you're sitting there, you're happy content in your trench and you're just lobbing rounds and whoever's head pops up, and the next thing you know, the enemy comes rushing in. So once the enemy comes rushing in, you then turn off your magazine cutoff switch and then you start cranking through the magazine tube. That could be beneficial if you could get that to work. Just something to take into account there. Now that's getting, all the adjustments that we're talking about to this rifle are really getting into some of the nitty-gritty hypothetical type aspects of it. But a very real aspect of this rifle is all this stuff that comes out of the bottom of the receiver every time you work the system. Now, of course, lever actions are very fast. They are faster than bolt actions because all I have to do is lever forward, lever back. It is 2 directional motions as opposed to the bolt action where I have to lift up, pull back, push forward, rotate down. You can see that's a little bit more motion. It's not difficult. It's still very fluid motion overall, but it's not as fast as just being able to move back and forth. And it's also a little bit easier to keep this rifle on the shoulder and also keep your sights generally aligned on the target, unlike with a bolt action, which all that motion and the bolt coming back into your face, you kind of got to lift your head and all that kind of stuff. You can actually stay on target while cycling this action. That's nice. That's something I appreciate. But all this stuff that falls out of the bottom leaves the possibility for the ingress of mud. And in the trenches of World War I, in the trenches of World War I, this is an issue because there's a lot of mud. There's a lot of debris out there that could potentially get sucked up into this rifle. And you wouldn't necessarily want that to happen in a combat environment. So that's something to consider there as well. And you got to have these portions. This is not something that we can get rid of. That is how we managed to keep a lightweight and very short overall design of the system, is how John Moses Browning developed this portion. But at this time, John Moses Browning has no real interest in any additional development on the 1894 Winchester because he's working on the BAR and his hands are kind of full. All right, guys. So we've discussed different aspects of what's going to impact the comparison between these two rifles. Let's take them to the range and let's do some accuracy scoring as well as some timed type events and see how these two rifles fare and discuss it afterwards.
Alright guys, and we're back. Now, you'll note that the background and my own appearance has changed a little bit. That is because I film all these videos well in advance, and because of some work type stuff, I actually had to delay the posting of this video quite significantly, which meant that though this video was filmed originally in early August, I didn't wind up actually getting shooting footage until late November, and now here we are in early December, and I'm finally getting it out there for you guys. So, just something to keep in mind, sometimes these interruptions happen. But I finally got the data. Let's go ahead and discuss it. Now, the first video that we ran through was just a magazine dump of sorts. Now, something to keep in mind, guys, I did not just shoot these rifles into the berm. Ammunition for these two guns is entirely too expensive and difficult to come by in order to just expend it willy-nilly like that. Instead, I engaged a 100-yard, 1/3 human silhouette steel target. So, that is what caused our engagement to take a little bit longer, as I had to reacquire the sights each time and actually try to hit the target. Now, if you look at the time breakdown on these, now my first run through with the Swedish Mauser, I actually had a malfunction. Which was a bit of a surprise, but I did manage to clear it. So I actually wound up shooting this rifle twice in order to be able to get the necessary time data to be able to compare. And I was somewhat surprised. Early on, I thought for sure the Winchester Model 94 was going to absolutely beat the pants off of the Swedish Mauser speed-wise. And maybe if I just dumped rounds into the berm, it would have. However, in this case, actually conducting a target engagement, the two were surprisingly comparable, with the Swedish Mauser outpacing the Winchester Model 94 by just a little bit. Now, eagle-eye viewers will have caught that I did not have these rifles equally loaded. I did run off of the actual capacities of the magazines, which means 6 rounds for the Winchester Model 94 and 5 rounds for the Swedish Mauser. Why did I do this? Well, because once again, we have to rate these rifles off of the features that they actually possess, and we'll get more into this here in a little bit. So yes, any soldier could just sit there and spray down a whole bunch of rounds out of his lever action rifle. However, is that necessarily going to help him out in this case? We'll talk about that more in the reloading section that's coming up next. But if we go ahead and take an average, because we can still work with the time data that we have here. If we go ahead and take an average for the engagement overall with the Swedish Mauser, we'll find that it's roughly 2.4 seconds per round fired. So if we go ahead and add an additional roughly 2.4 seconds to the engagement time, we find that the two rifles continue to be fairly comparable, but with the Winchester Model 94 being slightly faster. So, not quite the upset that this could have been, but definitely still the Winchester Model 94 has a little bit of an advantage going for it. Now, let's go ahead and get into this reload aspect. One more thing I want to talk about with sights, with these rifles on this shooting engagement real quick, is the sights. So I'm actually not a terribly big fan of buckhorn sights. Just they don't really line up naturally for me. I've never really cared for them. However, even though the sights on the Swedish Mauser are much simpler, I find that they snap together fairly naturally. It has to do something with how this rifle's contour. It just fits me in such a manner that generally whenever I come up on these sights, especially from a quick snap to, they're pretty much aligned and ready to go. Now, for reloads, I would for this part of the engagement, I loaded 1 round, fired it, and then loaded a full magazine and emptied it and incorporated all of that into the overall time, still engaging the same 100-yard target. So let's go ahead and take a look at that footage. All right, now I think it's no surprise in this case that the Swedish Mauser beat the Winchester Model 94 with about 17 seconds between the two of them. And this is where we kind of get back to perhaps a magazine cutoff would be really advantageous for the Winchester Model 94. And I actually took some footage out at the range to kind of better describe what it was that I was talking about.
All right, guys, let's try to show you what I mean about the lever thing. Okay, so go around into the magazine. We'll slowly open this. See right there. Let's see if we can fit in a live one. See? So that's what I mean about possibly being able to incorporate a magazine cutoff.
Now, as you can see from that footage, as you open the action, it is still trying to load the next round out of the magazine tube, but if you stop the lever before it kind of makes that final motion, the lifter does not rise into position to feed the round into the chamber. So in theory, you could limit that action one way or another, probably fairly simply, to make that into a magazine cutoff type feature. I'm sure somebody who's an engineer of some sort could design something that makes more sense, or perhaps can already be incorporated into the existing design. But that is something that you have to keep into account. Is this going to go from like a minor rework into a major redesign? Because if that's the case, if I'm a general sitting on the panel who's supposed to be making this decision, I would be very much so against the adoption at that point. I would drop the magazine cutoff feature as soon as it even had the inkling of slowing down the adoption and or issue of this particular weapon system. If we're at the point where we're looking at purchasing off-the-shelf type rifles in order to be able to bolster our rifle production or capacity, I want those guns in the hands of the intended recipients as fast as they can get there. So just something to kind of keep into account there, how I would grade the importance of features of like bayonet lug and handguard over magazine cutoff. And, well, adjustable sights also kind of going on the other side with the bayonet lug and everything like that. All right, so no big shock there. What about long range shooting? So I fired both of these rifles at about 400 yards, 412 to be exact. Let's go ahead and take a look at that footage. Now, again, there should be no surprises here. Now, something that was kind of interesting, I actually forgot to utilize the elevation adjustable rear sights on this particular rifle, and I just ran these as fixed sights, which is appropriate. The Winchester Model 94 does utilize fixed sights. And I had no real issue being able to make impacts at 400 on a steel man-sized target. And also the 6.5 Swede makes a terrific splash across steel. It makes it really easy to pick up your hits. The Winchester Model 94, on the other hand, was not so easy to do that with, which is unfortunate. So the first round I held roughly at about the target's head, and its impact was closer to about 300 yards. My subsequent rounds were me basically trying to walk my way up the berm, with my final round impacting 2 feet left, but at least finally good on windage, and that was with my front sight hovering about 6 to 8 feet above the target's head. So at that point, the gun is completely obscuring the target, making the observation of impacts kind of difficult. So let's talk about this a little bit further. The 3030 cartridge is notable because it's the first commercially available smokeless powder cartridge. However, it is not necessarily a pariah of advanced smokeless powder technology for the time. We're, as previously discussed, we're pretty well stuck to a round nose projectile. Which means that though we've got higher velocities than what we would expect out of smokeless powder, or excuse me, out of black powder, we still have a fairly rainbow-like trajectory, which is what's making long-range engagements so difficult with this. This is where adjustable ladder-type sights like we see on military rifles for the time become exceedingly important. That's one of the issues that we're looking at right off the bat with this rifle, and that's not even necessarily getting into cartridge adoption as well. So that's really what's going to wind up holding this rifle back in this case. If you can't get that flat shooting trajectory, which every other modern military cartridge for this time has, we have higher velocities, we have Spitzer type bullets, we have flatter shooting trajectories, and then you want to bring in something like this that is basically just, lobbing rounds at that distance, you kind of start to want to rethink what it is that you have going on there. All right, well guys, let's go ahead and try to sum this up some. So I'm a general, and I'm sitting on this panel trying to decide what it is that we need, what it is that we're going to do here. There's a couple things that stand out to me in this conversation. So this rifle, the Winchester Model 94, was used somewhat during World War I with the French issuing out to artillery batteries. Here's something to keep in mind. Artillerymen, engineers, cavalry, guys like these, they got, in a lot of different militaries, they got their own rifles. So a lot of them were shorter because they didn't have a need for a full-size infantry arm. A lot of times the weapons would be stacked off. In the case of cavalry, they wouldn't necessarily have bayonet lugs and all that type of stuff, right? So already, if we adopt this rifle in whatever configuration our fictitious military decides to adopt it in, and they decide that they're going to hand it off to the more rear echelon style of troops, that means that we're taking the present arms that those rear echelon style troops have and are moving them to the front line. So already we're working with suboptimal rifles, what are for the time considered to be suboptimal rifles, and pushing them to the front. Now, for the actual fighting involved in World War I, those rifles would do just fine. In fact, if anything, especially being a little bit shorter in a trench, is not a bad thing. However, we can't just think about the fight that is today. If things go well and we start pushing the enemy back, perhaps we wind up in the more conventional fight that we thought we were going to be in to begin with. And now those soldiers who are armed with those rifles that don't have the capability or the sights to be able to reach out to that distance are going to be at a disadvantage, especially if the enemy starts utilizing those tactics. Now they can be engaged more accurately from a greater distance than what they can return fire at. Is it likely to be an issue? No. By its very existence, by me even just saying it, does it suddenly become a plausible concern? Yes. That's how I would assess that as a general. Now, if I'm coming along and saying, well, then we'll just issue these out to rear echelon troops, it'll be no big deal, I also have to embrace the idea that at some point, these rifles aren't just going to stay in the hands of rear echelon troops, they're going to wind up in the hands of frontline troops. That trend is already showing, and therefore I have to embrace its possibility. So I can't just say, oh, well, it's fine for the rear echelon guys. It's okay if I allow this little issue or that little issue to be overlooked because it's never going to see frontline use. We already know that that is folly. So I have to embrace this rifle in its totality. And there's a couple of things that stand out as issues. Even if I get the bayonet lug, even if I get the upper handguard, even if I get the super adjustable sights, I still have this action, this exposed action, which in frontline trenches, which are muddy and have all kinds of environmental conditions going on, this is going to cause this gun to get jammed up real fast. And that's not going to be a good outcome. Even with the magazine cutoff feature, let's say that that gets adopted, I still have a tubular magazine. Very few militaries going into World War I have tubular magazines. It's actually kind of interesting because the French were the ones who kind of touched off the whole pre-World War I arms race with the development of smokeless powder and the adoption of the Lebel rifle. However, they kind of lost in the arms race overall, even having been so early a front runner, because they wound up getting stuck with a tubular feed magazine instead of being able to adapt their system over to stripper clips or M-block clips, some type of packet feeding methodology. This rifle will never be able to have that as well. So you're always going to wind up with this being a restriction. And even if initially a magazine cutoff is adopted, it's very likely that if anything else happens to production capability, it's going to get deleted. And trying to do something like, oh, well, it's fine, just slowly open the action, and then, you can replicate having a magazine cutoff without having a magazine cutoff, is not going to be sustainable in high-stress situations where it's very plausible that somebody's going to over-open the action, and then at that point, there's no point in trying to feed in another round, just close the action and get back to fighting. And trying to feed in another round from the side is an option, but I wouldn't recommend it because you're adding in additional manipulations and less time shooting. So now you have an ever-diminishing amount of ammunition in the magazine. At what point do you just say, forget it, and just run through your magazine and slowly reload? At some point, this rifle is going to become a disadvantage. It's become a weight around your shoulders very quickly. And that's to say nothing of a separate cartridge adoption. The 3030 Winchester was in service with no military, not on a grand scale. So especially if you're not an American military and you're adopting a foreign cartridge, you now have to rely on importation of foreign ammunition until you can get your own ammunition production underway. And now this comes into an interesting issue of where do you get the factory space? Where do you get the production capacity? Do you reduce your homegrown cartridge production capacity in order to be able to pursue a foreign commercial cartridge? That's getting into a really sticky wicket when it comes to weighing out your options and all that kind of stuff. Personally, if I was sitting on this panel charged with making this decision, I would not select the Winchester Model 94 no matter what configuration you presented it to me in. I would pursue the Winchester Model 1895 chambered in my already established cartridge because its action and its design is capable of being incorporated with it, as long as you run a stripper clip. Probably wouldn't handle an M-block clip too well, but a stripper clip it'd do just fine with. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you found this interesting, and, well, that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.